Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. It was many years ago that I first came into contact with Dante's little gem, the Vita Nuova, and it was thanks to a college course that I took on Dante. It was really a life-altering class for me. It was one of those courses that really change your perspective completely, mostly because the professor that we had seemed to be a living encyclopedia on Dante. I mean, this guy apparently had memorized every single footnote to the Divine Comedy. It was something really, really astonishing. So we read the Vita Nuova and then we moved on to the Divine Comedy. I know that many people, I think most people really enter the world of Dante through the gates of hell, but I would recommend actually reading the Vita Nuova before you read the Divine Comedy. So if you have not had the experience of Dante, I think that would be my most important advice to you today. What is La Vita Nuova about? I think it is really about the overwhelming, inspiring power that one human being may have on another. But if you like to keep things simple, if you don't want to complicate your life, I think we could also say that it's about love, period. And that is one of the things that we are going to explore today. So back when I took the course that I have just mentioned, I read the Mark Musa translation, which is this one right here, published by Oxford. I enjoyed it very much. Then many years later, I was at one of the libraries that are close by, and I was just, browsing the bookshelves, and I noticed that there was another translation, this one by David Slavitt. It was published by Harvard. So I was like, okay, it's a brief book. Let's check it out. Let's see how the two translations compare. And I really, really liked it. Now, more recently, right, we have this edition right here, published by Penguin, this time translated by Virginia Jewiss. And it's just excellent. And one thing that this has as an advantage to other editions is that it includes parallel text. So it's a dual language edition. In other words, if you are planning to look at the original Vita Nuova, and if you want to check it out, the translation in comparison to the original text, I think we can say, very, very safely that this would be the edition to go with. So Vita Nuova, as you may know, that translates as new life, okay, like that great song by Depeche Mode, okay. It's not a very well-known song, but I absolutely love it, and I love that band, by the way. But anyway, the book revolves around a turning point in Dante's life, and that is the moment that he saw Beatrice Portinari for the first time, when they were both just 8 years old. He was a little bit older than her, but they were both 8 at the time. This is not really the story of a romantic relationship. Why not? Well, I would say because not much really appears to have happened between Dante and Beatrice. And I am not talking here about like physical contact or anything like that. What I mean is, by his own account, what we have is that they seem to have exchanged only greetings, maybe glances, looks, things like that. So really, not much happened between them. Beatrice died at the age of 24 only, and the last time that Dante saw her in his life, she was only 16. So Dante's idolization, I would say here, is just amazing here. He had so little to go by, but it just seemed to have been enough for him to turn Beatrice into this superhuman figure, if you will. It's one of those things where really he just idolized this woman, idealized her too, you could also say. So regarding genre, okay, I always like to discuss a little bit this very important topic. Vita Nuova, taken by itself, could have been just a wonderful collection of poetry, okay? Just that. If you just take this as a collection of poetry, that would have been fantastic and just enough to consider it a classic. So this is romantic poetry at its best. But I would say that it is also much, much more than that, because what I would say Vita Nuova is a poetic journal. Or even, I would describe it as meta-poetry. What you get here is this. Dante describes his encounters with Beatrice, and most of the time those encounters culminate in a sonnet or in canzoni. So you get those poems as a result of his experiences of seeing Beatrice or remembering her. Most of the time also he's going to explain the structure of the poems. So that is where the meta-poetry comes in. So basically what you have here is, yes, poetry and prose, but you also get poetry and exegesis, because he really goes into details as to what he is doing in each one of these poems. So some texts that I was thinking about in relation to that when it comes to genre, I thought of The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Basho, right? There you also have this combination, wonderful just combination of poetry and prose. But I also thought, for example, of St. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul, right? There you also have this tiny poem, really. It's really, really short. And he just goes into this explanation. He really expounds on this poem and the meaning behind it. And that is what Dante does in Vita Nuova. Primarily, what interests me about this book is the effect that love has on Dante. Okay, and that is primarily what I want to explore today with you. So the feeling that lies at the core of this book, Vita Nuova, is really a very complex one. And I think what happens here is that Dante elevates Beatrice. This is what happens when you're in love. You know, you just take the person that you're in love with and you just elevate them. You put them on a pedestal. And in the case of Dante, this happens almost to the point of deification. I think he almost turns Beatrice into a godlike figure. If you look at chapter 24, for example, of the Vita Nuova, there he compares Primavera, who is Beatrice's friend, to St. John the Baptist, and Beatrice herself to Jesus, simply because when they were walking, Primavera happened to be walking ahead of Beatrice, just as St. John the Baptist came before Christ, right? So look at that. I mean, just that is an example of what Dante does. I just saw a squirrel walking by with the figure of Beatrice. And then I wanted to share with you just his reaction. This is in chapter 11 of the Vita Nuova. His reaction to simply seeing Beatrice, okay? So he says, "Let me say that whenever she appeared anywhere, the hope of her wondrous greeting emptied me of all enmity, and kindled instead a flame of charity that inspired me to forgive whoever had offended me. My face was veiled in humility, and were someone to ask me anything just then, my only reply would have been love." And I'm skipping a little bit here. "And when her most gracious greeting reached me, it's not that love intervened to veil its unbearable beatitude from me, but rather abundant sweetness made him such that my body, which was completely in his command, moved like some heavy, lifeless object." All of that inspired by a simple hello. Okay, so I think that is really amazing. You can tell that Dante was just enraptured by love. He was completely overtaken by love. In chapter 14, for example, he says that this feeling of ecstasy, and you can tell that this is what he's going through because of what I just read to you. This feeling of ecstasy that you experience with love is something that people who have never been in love are never going to understand. But those who have will, right? So that is a point that he makes in that chapter 14. So we may ask ourselves, how can just seeing a person, right, the mere sight of a person, inspire such a deep feeling? Well, you know what I thought about when I was reading that? I think this is a connection I made mostly due to my culture, you know, the culture that I come from. There's a famous, very brief poem, I'm talking very brief, 4 lines only, by Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer, the great romantic poet from Spain, that deals with a very, very similar situation right here. So let me recite this poem to you in Spanish, since it's so short, you know, and then I'll offer you a brief kind of a, you know, pedestrian translation in English, and we can maybe compare Dante's feelings with this. So here's the poem. Hoy la tierra y los cielos me sonríen. Hoy llega al fondo de mi alma el sol. Hoy la he visto y me ha mirado. Hoy creo en Dios. And that means roughly, today the earth and the heavens smile at me. Today the sun reaches the depths of my soul. Today I saw her. I saw her and she looked at me. Today I believe in God. So you see what I'm saying? It's one of those things, right? If you have ever had a terrible day and you just saw somebody who completely changed your outlook on things, then you know what these guys are talking about, okay? Dante and Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer. I think that that's the way that love should be. You know, love should transform us utterly, just like it did with Dante and with Bécquer and so many others. There's one famous poem in Vita Nuova. It's the one that you're going to find on chapter 21 that is also dedicated to this miracle. So let me, right before we end this video, so you can kind of look forward to this, I'm going to share that poem with you in Italian. I'm going to see if I can do that, okay? Just so that you can also get a sense of how Dante sounds in the original when he's in a poetic, like in a lyrical mode. There's also the canzone in chapter 33, also one of my favorites, and it deals also with this idea of the transforming power of love. Now this brings us to that question, okay, the very important, the crucial question, a question that was raised by that great philosopher, David Coverdale of Whitesnake. Is this love? Is this really love? Okay, so it seems that Dante and Beatrice really did not have a very close connection in the traditional sense of the term. They exchanged basically greetings and looks, as we said before. They never actually got to know each other truly. So if you look at it that way, right, and I'm going here by a text that I have mentioned to you before, The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm. In that book, Erich Fromm says that in order for it to be love, then there has to be some kind of knowledge, right, that one cannot love a person that one does not know. Now that said, okay, at the same time, I believe personally that soulmates, and I do believe in soulmates, okay, they may get at first sight some kind of an intuition, right, of the love that is going to develop between them. Because as I always say, when it comes to love, pretty much everything is possible. So I really think that this is something that could happen, and maybe that is what we have here between Dante and Beatrice. It is obvious to me, I can tell you, that Dante had really, really strong feelings for Beatrice, and I think this is mainly because to him she probably illustrated or exemplified or incarnated things like goodness, right, like beauty, like purity, things like that. So the question here could be, would his feelings have been the same if he had actually gotten the chance to know her, if they had actually, lived together, if a relationship had developed? We're never going to know. And there's another very important thing that we're never going to know, and that is something that I ask myself all the time. What did Beatrice actually think of Dante? Was she even aware of him as Dante, right? So that is another question that unfortunately we don't get the answer to. I wish we had the Vita Nuova, the other side of the story, written by Beatrice. But, I mean, that would be a creative project, I guess, for another person, not for me, because I don't think I would be able to do something like that or to write that type of text. But here, let me show you the cover. Because I think, one of my friends was talking to me about this. We were sharing ideas on the covers of the Vita Nuova. And he said, I hope that you say something about the illustration on the cover. So for this illustration, they went with kind of a mosaic type of approach. And I really like that, because a mosaic is put together, it's like an image, right? Put together with things that do not belong to it. And it also gives you the idea of, yes, this is an image, this is a whole, right? But it's also broken into different pieces. And here you can see Dante staring at Beatrice, but Beatrice is not staring back at him. She has her gaze up in heaven. And I think that really is a wonderful illustration. So I really, really like this cover. So, there are my 2 cents on the cover art. At the end of the Vita Nuova, Dante says and promises that he's going to write about Beatrice what has never been written of a lady. And of course, we know that he is referring to the Divine Comedy. And I think he kept his promise, okay? I think to this day we can say that nothing like the Divine Comedy has been written about a lady, okay? So that is just my idea of it. So whether we think this is love or not, going back to that question right there, I think that Dante's encounter with Beatrice produced just an immortal work of literature, a work of literature that is just impossible to imitate and maybe even to surpass. And it made Beatrice's memory survive for centuries. Okay, I think that is huge. And here, we can try a little experiment, just think about any celebrity who happens to be en vogue right now, okay? Those actors, those actresses that seem to be in every single movie that comes out, okay? I could name names, but I'm not going to. We'll just leave it there. But think about that celebrity, and let's ask ourselves, what are the odds that that person is going to be remembered 735 years after his or her death? So that's my point with this thing. I think this is really, really something that we should consider. And Beatrice has just been immortalized, whether we think this was actually love or not. So the Vita Nuova is really a very straightforward book, especially if you compare it to the Divine Comedy. You need a lot more context, a lot more footnotes for that. It's easier to grasp, definitely, than the Divine Comedy, but it also has a lot of surprises to it. So what I wanted to do before we close this video is to share with you 3 important points about Dante's poetics that I think you can already see in the Vita Nuova, maybe in embryo, but these are still definitely there. The first point that I wanted to emphasize is the preoccupation with dreams. And in the Vita Nuova, you get a lot of that, and you get a lot of wonderful images thanks to that. For example, in chapter 3, right? In chapter 3, love personified appears to Dante, holding his heart in his hand, and then he proceeds to feed that heart to a lady. So images like that you can get only in dreams, only in surrealist literature. As you know, dreams are very important also in the Divine Comedy, and I think I even wrote a paper on that at one point, though it was probably inspired by something that Borges had written. I think in one of the 9 Dantesque essays you can find an essay on that topic. So I'll definitely share this with you when I look at that book by Borges. So that's point number 1, dreams. Point number 2, or feature number 2, would be numerology. Okay, and for this one I recommend that you look at chapter 29 of the Vita Nuova, where he goes into this whole explanation or exploration, meditation on the number 9 and how it is related to Beatrice. So there you have numerology too. And the third one, the third feature that I think is this is key to Dante, okay, is the use of the vernacular as opposed to the use of Latin, okay? In chapter 25, he goes into that and he tells us a little bit about the creative liberties, like the poetic license that someone can take when writing in the vernacular. And the reason why I say this is very important is because, as you may know, one of Dante's big things, one of the reasons why Dante is so important is because he departed from that rule of writing in Latin and he wrote in his own language. He was saying, look, writing in the vernacular is okay, it's really, you can do it, So I think that really opened a lot of doors right there for all kinds of literature, really. So the bottom line is this. I would say once again, let me emphasize this again. If you are new to Dante, if you have never had the opportunity to read the Divine Comedy, I would say please read the Vita Nuova first. This is going to give you just so much insight into the poet. And as a result, I believe you're going to enjoy the Divine Comedy a lot more. That's what we did in the class, and that's what I would recommend that you do. I have read this book 3 times. Every time I read a different translation. And I can tell you, all of them were excellent, in different ways, right? Some of the translations take more liberties than others, but I would say no matter what translation you decide to read, I think you're going to have a very, very good experience with this text. It's one of my favorite ones, and I mentioned it when I did that video on Aurélia, that Memoir of Madness by Gérard de Nerval. It's very closely related to that book, so if you like that book or if you want something to compare it to, I would definitely say, the Vita Nuova is a good text to go with. And it's just essential reading to anybody who wants to understand and appreciate Dante. Before I leave, a couple of things. The first one, I want to recommend a movie to you that also deals with this idea of a guy idealizing, idolizing, deifying a lady, okay, with very different outcome, of course. But one of my favorite movies, I think I've shown you this before, is 500 Days of Summer. As I said, very different outcome, but the idea there, this idea of first love, maybe in a misguided way, in this one. Actually, scratch that maybe, okay? Let's just leave it there. So check it out, really good structure, just a very fun movie. I discuss this movie with my classes, with my students sometimes, and they always seem to like it very much. So I think this is something that you might enjoy. Kind of a comedy, but with moments of not comedy, really. And then the other thing is I wanted to fulfill my promise, and let's see how this goes, of reading you that poem, that sonnet from the Vita Nuova. That is one of my favorites. I think this is my favorite poem from the entire book. So that's why I wanted to share it with you. And before I do, I want to apologize, okay? So especially to my Italian friends. I don't speak Italian, unfortunately. I'm going by the text here, and I'm just gonna do my heart is beating right now. I'm just really nervous, but I'm gonna try to do this so as to give you an idea of what it sounds like in Italian, of course, read by an Argentine US guy. Okay, so here we go. Negli occhi porta la mia donna amore, perché si fa gentil ciò ch'ella mira. Ov'ella passa, ognuno ver lei si gira, e qui saluta fa tremar lo core, sì che, bassando il viso, tutto ismore, ed ogni su difetto allor sospira. Fugge dinanzi a lei superbia e ira. Aiutatemi, donne, farle onore. Ogni dolcezza, ogni pensiero umile nasce nel core a chi parlar la sente, onde laudato chi prima la vide. Quel ch'ella par quando un poco sorride, non si può dire né tenere a mente, si è nuovo miracolo e gentile. So, do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? As always, you can just leave them in the comments section. I hope you enjoyed this video. Those were my 2 cents on the Vita Nuova by Dante Alighieri. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.